Daniel hurled the hoe aside and sprinted toward the shed. A desperate meow cut through the air, sharper with every step. He dropped to his knees, tore up the loose plank, and yanked out a trembling gray kitten. Its paw dangled unnaturally, and it hissed weakly before collapsing in his hands. He bolted into the barn, scattering tools across the workbench. Grabbing a wrench, he pried open an old tin for wire, ripped a strip from his shirt, and forced the joint back into place. The kitten shivered but didn't fight. Daniel's hands moved faster, splint, knot, lift, until the tiny creature lay still, breathing, watching him as if it knew something he didn't. He couldn't explain why this mattered so much, but fixing that paw lit a spark in him. Using 2 copper rods from a broken rake and wooden spools as wheels, he built a crude cart so the kitten could walk. It rolled awkwardly, but it worked. Boot steps shook the barn floor. His father burst in, eyes cold, pointing to the fields. Daniel held the kitten instead of the hoe. Without a word, the old man smashed the cart under his boot and left. The crunch of wood and wheels echoed in Daniel's head. Anger tightened his chest, but it didn't smother the idea forming in his mind. If he could make a cart from scrap, he could do more, fix machines, save the farm. He went to the junk heap, dragged out a rusted pump, and forced the blades free. With grease from the tractor axle, he coaxed the shaft to turn. Soon, water trickled through a hose into the parched soil. That small victory didn't last. A truck rolled in, spitting dust. The bank officer stepped out with 2 men carrying stakes and ribbon. Papers were signed, warnings given, 3 days to pay or the land would be gone. Daniel refused to watch his father lose everything. He ran to the dead tractor, ripped off the cracked belt, and made a new one from an inner tube and twine. After fighting the starter until his knuckles bled, the engine finally roared. He hooked it to the pump, and water surged in clean arcs. For a moment, it felt like hope. The moment shattered when a coupling burst, drenching the bank officer. Stakes still went in, marking the soil like a death sentence. Daniel rebuilt the kitten's cart with lighter wheels. As the animal took cautious steps, sirens wailed from the fence line. Fire. He grabbed a shovel, dug a break, dragged the hose through smoke, and fought until neighbors arrived with a tank rig. The flames died, but the clock on their future kept ticking. That night, his father didn't thank him. Instead, he pointed at the bank papers and said, 3 days. Prove it. Daniel met his stare, then looked at the kitten curled in his jacket. He wasn't just going to prove it, he was going to change everything. The next morning Daniel woke before the sun, the bank's deadline burning in his mind. The kitten was still asleep in his jacket pocket, breathing softly. He left it curled on a blanket in the barn and walked to the tractor. The engine from yesterday's repair was holding, but it wasn't enough. The pump needed more power, more capacity, something that could flood the furrows faster than men could with buckets and hoses. He took stock of the junk pile, eyes scanning every rusted frame and discarded part. It wasn't just metal to him anymore, each piece was a possibility. He found an old motorcycle engine, half buried under scrap. The casing was cracked, the carburetor gummed up, but the cylinder looked sound. That engine could run a second pump, if he could get it alive. Back in the barn, he stripped it down with methodical speed, laying the parts in rows. Years on the farm had taught him to work with nothing but stubbornness and whatever tools he could steal from other jobs. Every bolt, every gasket was a challenge. He cleaned the carburetor with gasoline, sanded the piston smooth, replaced a missing seal with leather cut from an old boot. By mid-morning, the sun was already punishing. His shirt clung to his back, but he didn't slow. When the engine finally sputtered to life, coughing smoke into the rafters, he grinned for the first time in days. It wasn't victory, but it was a weapon in the fight. He rigged the motorcycle engine to a smaller pump, drawing water from the old well. Soon 2 streams were feeding into the furrows. The soil drank it in, darkening row by row. From the porch, his father watched, arms crossed, saying nothing. By evening, Daniel's hands were raw, but the pumps were running steady. That's when the sound came, a faint rattle of an approaching engine. He stepped outside to see the bank officer's truck again, dust rising behind it. This time the man wasn't alone. Another stranger climbed out, wearing a pressed shirt and polished shoes. He walked the perimeter, jotting notes, inspecting the stakes in the ground. Daniel didn't need to be told, this was the buyer, already measuring the land as if it were his. The sight was like a punch to the gut, but it also lit a fire in him. 3 days wasn't a deadline anymore, it was a wall, and he had to break through it. That night, in the dim light of a single bulb, Daniel worked on plans. He sketched out an irrigation layout that would flood the entire field in a fraction of the time. It would mean running the pumps in tandem, using salvaged piping from the scrapyard, and building a makeshift distribution manifold from old oil drums. It was insane, but if it worked, the crop would be saved. The kitten limped over, paw still braced in the new cart, and climbed onto the bench beside him. Daniel paused, scratching its head. "We're not losing this place," he whispered. The words weren't just a promise, they were a challenge to himself. When dawn broke again, he'd have less than 2 days left. And he still had no idea where he'd find the parts to make it happen. Before the first light reached the horizon, Daniel was already on the road. The pumps at the farm wouldn't hold the fight alone, he needed more pipe, connectors, and a valve big enough to handle both lines at once. The scrapyard was his only hope, but it was miles away, and he had no transport. He walked fast, keeping his head down, until he heard the rumble of an old flatbed truck behind him. He waved it down, breathless. The driver, a wiry man with grease-stained hands, leaned out. "You fix engines?" Daniel nodded. 5 minutes later, he was under the truck, tightening a loose driveshaft coupling. The man grinned, waved him aboard, and they were moving. At the scrapyard, Daniel scanned the rusted hills of discarded machines. He climbed over heaps of twisted steel, pulling out lengths of pipe, a bent manifold, and a heavy cast-iron valve. The pieces were ugly, pitted with rust, but they were strong. The yard manager wanted cash Daniel didn't have, but a broken portable generator in the corner caught his eye. "Give me an hour," he said. He stripped the generator down, cleaned the carb, bypassed the dead starter, and had it running in 40 minutes. The manager nodded once. "Take your junk." By the time the flatbed dropped him near the farm, the sun was high and the air thick with heat. Daniel hauled the pipes to the barn, cutting and grinding them into place. He welded with an old arc unit that spat and hissed, sealing the leaks as best he could. Each bead of molten metal felt like it burned time away. As he worked, he caught sight of the stranger in the pressed shirt again, this time standing by the bank officer's truck. They talked quietly, pointing toward the fields. Daniel turned back to his welding, jaw clenched. By late afternoon, the manifold was assembled, 2 inlets, 1 wide outlet branching into 3 smaller lines. He connected the motorcycle pump and the tractor pump, primed them both, and pulled the starters. Engines roared, water surged, and 3 streams shot across the field. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. For the first time, the soil across the entire stretch darkened evenly. If the plants could drink deep for the next 2 days, maybe they'd survive. That evening, exhaustion pressed heavy on his shoulders, but there was no stopping. He checked every joint, tightened every clamp. The kitten followed him, its small wheels bumping over the dirt floor. Sometimes it darted ahead of him, forcing him to pause, and he found himself grateful for those seconds of stillness. When darkness fell, Daniel stayed in the barn, sleeping in short bursts beside the pumps. Once, near midnight, the motorcycle engine sputtered and died. He was on his feet instantly, pulling the carb apart under the dim bulb, fingers black with oil. 10 minutes later, it was running again. By dawn, his eyes were gritty, his hands torn and blistered, but the water still flowed. 2 days left. By the second morning, Daniel noticed the first problem. The water in the old well was running lower than he had ever seen. Each time the pumps drew, the stream weakened. If the source ran dry before the crops soaked enough, everything would fail. He shut down the motorcycle pump to save pressure, then sprinted to the far edge of the property where a narrow creek ran through the neighboring land. It wasn't much, but it flowed steady. The problem was the barbed wire fence and the "no trespassing" signs. That land belonged to Harrow, a man known for chasing people off with a shotgun. Daniel paced along the fence, scanning for a way to pull water without stepping onto Harrow's soil. The solution came as a half-mad idea: a siphon line running from the creek over the fence to the pump. It would mean carrying nearly 100 feet of hose and rigging a support frame to keep the inlet high and clean. He jogged back to the barn, tore apart the scrap pile, and built the frame from 2 rusted ladders bolted together. By midday, sweat stung his eyes, but the frame stood over the fence like a crude water bridge. He dragged the hose out, weighted the intake with a rock-filled can, and dropped it into the creek. When the pump roared to life, clear water surged over the fence and into the manifold. Relief washed through him, until a voice did too. "What the hell is that?" Harrow's tone was pure anger. He stood on the far bank, shotgun in one hand, eyes locked on the hose. Daniel's mouth went dry. "Borrowing water. Just for a couple days." "You're stealing," Harrow snapped. 2 hours to take it down, or I cut it myself." Daniel didn't argue. He shut the pump, pulled the hose, and hauled the whole rig back. The creek was gone as an option. Back at the barn, he stared at the weakening stream from the well. Panic scratched at the edges of his thoughts, but he shoved it down. If the well couldn't keep up, he'd have to dig. He found an old hand auger, rusted and bent, and set to work near the lowest point of the field. Hours passed, each turn of the handle pulling up mud and grit. By dusk, the auger bit into damp earth, and a trickle appeared. Not much, but enough to feed a small auxiliary pump if he could find one. In the dim light, Daniel pulled the smallest pump from the heap, a corroded thing missing half its bolts. He rebuilt it with scraps, greased the seals, and primed it with water from the trough. By midnight, it hummed weakly, pushing a narrow stream into the manifold. It wasn't strong, but it bought him time. He fell asleep on the dirt floor, the kitten curled against his ribs. In dreams, he heard the pump stop and the field crack in the sun. He woke before dawn, heart racing, and ran to check them. They were still running, but the well's level was even lower. 1 day left. The final day began with the sound Daniel dreaded most, the tractor engine coughing into silence. He sprinted to the barn, yanked open the hood, and saw oil pooled under the block. A seal had blown, and without oil, the engine would seize within minutes of running. He grabbed the last quart from the shelf, poured it in, and wrapped the leaking joint with strips of leather soaked in resin. It was a gamble, temporary at best. He started the engine, listening to the uneven rattle, and pushed it back into service. By mid-morning, clouds gathered on the horizon. Not the dark, heavy kind that promised rain, these were the sharp-edged, dust-laden ones that came before the windstorms. If they hit full force, the young plants could be scoured from the soil in an hour. Daniel ran the length of the field, checking every line, every clamp. The pumps roared, but the wind was rising. Dust whipped at his face as he anchored the hoses with scrap iron. He'd seen storms like this before. They could strip the topsoil bare and leave nothing but dead roots. By noon, the wind howled. He pulled sheets of corrugated metal from the barn, setting them as makeshift windbreaks along the most vulnerable rows. The kitten followed at his heels until a gust nearly flipped its cart. Daniel scooped it up, tucking it inside his jacket, and kept working. Through the swirling dust, he saw the bank officer's truck again, this time moving slow, the pressed-shirt stranger beside him. They stopped at the porch, speaking with his father. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the resignation in the old man's stance. He wasn't planning to fight anymore. The storm hit harder. One of the pump hoses tore loose, flailing like a snake and spraying water into the air. Daniel ran to grab it, slipping in the mud, his palms skinned raw as he forced the clamp back into place. Every second without water meant the soil was drying in the wind. Then came the worst. The motorcycle pump sputtered and died. He lunged to restart it, but the pull cord jammed. Inside, the flywheel was locked. Sand had blown into the intake. He stripped it down with frantic hands, scraping grit from the cylinder, re-oiling it with what was left in the can. When it finally roared back to life, Daniel's chest felt like it might split from the strain, but he kept moving. The wind didn't ease until near sundown, leaving the fields ragged but still alive. Exhausted, he slumped against the barn wall, the kitten curled on his lap. He had no idea if it had been enough. Tomorrow, the bank would come. And if they decided the land wasn't worth saving, all of it, every fight, every sleepless night, would mean nothing. In the fading light, Daniel stood and walked to the pumps one last time, tightening the clamps and wiping the grit from the valves. "One more night," he whispered. "Hold together for one more night." The morning sun broke over the horizon, sharp and unforgiving. Daniel was already by the pumps, listening to the steady thrum of the engines. The field lay in front of him, darkened soil, plants standing a little taller than yesterday. It looked alive. He just didn't know if it was alive enough. A rumble grew in the distance. The bank officer's truck rolled down the dusty road, the pressed-shirt stranger beside him again. This time, another vehicle followed, a heavy black sedan with tinted windows. Daniel's stomach tightened. Whoever sat in that car wasn't here for small talk. The vehicles stopped in the yard. His father came out to meet them, wiping his hands on a rag. No one smiled. The bank officer opened his folder, flipped through papers, and began listing numbers: loan balance, overdue interest, foreclosure costs. His father didn't interrupt. Then the man from the black sedan stepped forward. Mid-50s, silver hair, eyes sharp. "I'm here to inspect," he said simply, walking toward the field without waiting for permission. The others followed, Daniel trailing behind, heart pounding. They reached the edge of the rows. The stranger crouched, running a hand over the soil. He pulled a stem, crushed it lightly between his fingers, and nodded once. "You've been irrigating," he said. His tone wasn't accusing, just stating fact. Daniel met his eyes. "I built a system. 2 pumps, split manifold. The plants should survive." The man studied him for a moment. "Why bother? This place is finished in 3 days." "Because it's not finished," Daniel said. "Not if the crop comes in." A small smile touched the man's lips, but it vanished quickly. He stood, looking back at the bank officer. "If the yield's good, there's value here. If not, it's worthless." They walked the rows in silence. The kitten, in its cart, rolled behind Daniel, attracting a glance from the silver-haired man. He didn't comment, but something in his expression softened. Back at the porch, the bank officer closed his folder. "We'll decide tomorrow," he said. "If the buyer's still interested, the deal goes through." He jerked a thumb toward the stranger. "You've got one night to prove this field's worth a damn." The vehicles left, leaving a cloud of dust and a knot in Daniel's chest. One night. He went straight to the pumps, checking every seal, every line. The well's level was dangerously low again. He pushed both engines to full output, flooding the farthest rows. By afternoon, the motors were running hot. He cooled them with buckets from the trough, praying they'd hold. As the sun dipped, he walked the entire field, pulling weeds, propping bent stems, anything to make the rows look stronger. His father stayed on the porch, silent. When darkness fell, Daniel lit a lantern and stayed with the pumps. Every sound, every cough of the engine, sent a jolt through him. The kitten curled on the workbench, watching. Tomorrow would decide everything. And if the engines failed before morning, there wouldn't be a tomorrow for this farm at all. The night air was heavy, carrying the scent of damp soil and hot metal. Daniel sat on an overturned crate beside the pumps, lantern light flickering over the machinery. Every few minutes he stood, laid a hand on each engine, and listened for changes in their rhythm. The steady pulse was the only thing keeping the knot in his chest from tightening further. Near midnight, a sputter cut through the calm. The motorcycle pump coughed once, twice, and fell silent. Daniel was moving before the echo faded, wrench in hand. He popped the cover, finding the fuel line dry. The well's flow had slowed again. He ran to the trough, filled a bucket, and poured it into the intake to prime the line. The pump groaned back to life, but weaker. If the level dropped much lower, the suction would break completely. That's when he noticed the tractor pump's exhaust was glowing hotter than it should. He shut it down, yanked the side panel, and found the leather patch on the oil seal soaked through and dripping. The reservoir was nearly empty. He didn't have another drop of oil. For a moment, panic froze him. Then his eyes landed on the toolbox, and inside it, a can of heavy grease. It wasn't meant for engines, but it was thick enough to coat the moving parts. He packed it into the housing, sealed it with strips of cloth, and restarted the engine. It rattled, but it ran. Hours crawled by. Daniel walked the field with the lantern, checking for leaks in the lines. At the far end, he found one, water hissing into the dirt from a split hose. He cut the damaged section away, rejoined the ends with a scrap of pipe, and lashed it tight with wire. Back at the barn, the kitten stirred in its cart, watching him as if it knew how close everything was to breaking. Daniel sat beside it for a minute, his hands trembling from exhaustion. "Just till sunrise," he whispered. "That's all we need." Around 3 a.m., the wind picked up, carrying a chill. Clouds slid across the moon, and for a moment, the whole farm was swallowed in darkness except for his lantern. He tightened his grip on the handle and kept moving. At 5 a.m., the first pale light touched the horizon. Both pumps were still running, though their rhythm was uneven. Daniel stood at the edge of the field, watching the rows glisten in the dawn. This was the best the land had looked in months. In a few hours, they'd know if it mattered. By mid-morning, the sound of engines came from the road. Daniel stood at the edge of the field, wiping grease from his hands, the pump still droning in the background. The bank officer's truck led the way, the pressed shirt buyer beside him. The black sedan followed close behind. They parked in the yard. The buyer stepped out first, scanning the fields with an unreadable expression. The bank officer followed, flipping open his folder. His father emerged from the porch, slow and silent, as if he'd already accepted whatever was about to happen. No one spoke as they walked to the first row. Daniel's stomach churned. The plants stood straighter now, leaves greener than they'd been in weeks, but was it enough? The buyer crouched, pulled up a handful of soil, crumbled it between his fingers. He didn't look impressed, or disappointed. Just, calculating. They moved down the rows, stopping here and there. The bank officer jotted notes. Daniel kept catching him glancing toward the far end of the field where the soil was lighter, where the pumps hadn't reached as well. He clenched his fists, willing them not to notice. At the manifold, the buyer examined the welds, the piping, the patched hoses. "You built this?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "How long will it last?" Daniel hesitated. "Long enough to finish the season." The buyer straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. It wasn't a challenge, more like he was weighing the truth of it. Halfway back to the yard, the motorcycle pump sputtered. Everyone turned. Daniel's pulse spiked. He broke into a run, kicking the choke, yanking the cord. The engine coughed, spat smoke, then caught again. He stood there breathing hard, aware all eyes were on him. Back in the yard, the bank officer closed his folder. "We'll discuss it," he said to the buyer. The man gave no answer, only glanced once more at the rose shimmering in the sun. Then the silver-haired stranger from the sedan approached Daniel. "You've done a lot in 3 days," he said. "But I'm not sure it's enough." Daniel met his gaze. "Let me finish what I started. You'll see." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly and walked back to his car without another word. The vehicles pulled away, leaving only the sound of the pumps and the wind in the leaves. Daniel stood in the yard, unsure if he'd just saved the farm, or bought it 3 more days before the end. The next morning was silent, too silent. No engines, no trucks, no word from the bank. Daniel was by the pumps before sunrise, checking fuel, tightening clamps. The field shimmered under a thin mist, plants swaying gently. It looked like life, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. By midday, the sun was high, and still no one had come. His father stayed inside, saying nothing. Daniel worked the rows, pulling weeds, propping the weakest stalks with sticks, anything to make them stronger. Every hour he expected to hear tires on the gravel road. It wasn't until late afternoon that he saw dust on the horizon. The black sedan, alone this time, rolled into the yard. The silver-haired man stepped out, carrying no papers, no folder, just a small notebook in his hand. Daniel met him halfway. "So?" The man didn't answer. He walked past Daniel to the edge of the field, standing there for a long minute. Finally, he turned. "The crop's better than I expected. But the bank still wants its money. I can't change that." Daniel's chest tightened. "Then it's over." "Not necessarily," the man said. He flipped open his notebook, scribbled something, tore the page out, and handed it over. "That's a figure. If you can match it by the end of the week, the land stays yours." Daniel stared at the number. It was less than the full debt, but still more than he'd ever held in his hands at once. "Why?" The man's eyes shifted toward the barn, where the kitten sat in its cart by the door. "Because you fight for what matters. Most people don't." Then he got back in the sedan and drove away, leaving Daniel standing in the yard with the paper in his hand. The sun was already dropping. 3 days of work had kept the field alive, but now a different battle loomed, finding the money before the week ended. Daniel looked at the pump still churning, the dark soil drinking in the water, and the kitten watching him silently. He didn't know where the money would come from. He didn't know if the engines would even last until harvest. But he knew one thing: he wasn't stopping. Not now. He folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and walked back to the barn. The pumps rattled in the fading light, their rhythm uneven, as if they too were wondering how long they could hold on. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from far off, maybe hours away, maybe days. Daniel stood in the doorway, listening. Somewhere behind the clouds, a storm was coming. Whether it would save them or finish them, he couldn't tell. Not yet.